Hey, Mr. McCarty here. Today, we're going to be talking about the Revolutionary War and how America actually wins its independence. So, the Revolutionary War, as most of you guys should know, breaks out just outside of Boston here. And so, here's Boston. And the shot heard around the world happens here at Lexington, and that's considered the beginning of the revolution. And so this is April 18th, 1775. This is after the Intolerable Acts and the Stamp Act and all that kind of stuff. The American colonists are starting to prepare themselves after the Intolerable Acts and the Boston Massacre and the Tea Party. And so they start like training their militias. They start stockpiling weapons. The British, through spies, here, the American colonists are stockpiling weapons here in Concord, about 20 miles from Boston. And so April 18th, 1775, in the night, the British basically leave their ships and they start heading towards Concord to seize the weapons. Of course, the word goes out. Paul Revere, William Dawes. The word spreads that the British are coming. They warn the militiamen, the Minutemen. They get together in the morning when the sun's coming up. We have about 60 American militiamen who meet the British at a place called Lexington on Lexington Green. So you have 60 militiamen against 700 regulars. Like, this is the strongest military in the world. Versus 60 militiamen. And so we don't know who fired the very first shot. Was it the British? Was it the Americans? We'll never know. Somebody pulled the trigger. At the end of that little skirmish there, 8 colonists lay dead, and those are the first shots of the American Revolution. The American colonists, obviously it's 60 versus 700, they kind of took off and went running there. And so they kind of spread out and went running, and the American colonists spread the word that the British are, killed us, and they're also heading towards Concord. And so the British continue to Concord. They do make it to Concord. And then at Concord, they don't really find anything because the American soldiers, the American colonists hid their weapons. They buried them. They hid them in haystacks, whatever they could do. So the British kind of burn some barns, and then they head back to Boston empty-handed. Now word has spread to the other militiamen that they've killed people. And so on this 20-mile march back to Boston, the American colonists basically line the road in the trees, and they start picking off the British, and they kill almost 100 British on their way back to Boston. And then the British are held up there in Boston under the command of a guy named General Gage. And so under General Gage, that was April of 1775. In June of 1775, we have our first major battle between the American colonists and the British. And it takes place at Bunkers Hill, or more correctly, Breed's Hill here. And so at Bunkers Hill, Breed's Hill, what happens is Breed's Hill is where it actually happens. It was supposed to be Bunkers Hill, but they read the map wrong. They went to the wrong hill. So it's really Breed's Hill, but we call it Bunker Hill. That doesn't really matter. And so at Breed's Hill, or Bunker Hill, whatever you want to call it, the British decide to kind of make an example out of the Americans and kind of get this revolution over quickly. They thought they could just walk over the Americans, destroy them, and like the revolution would be done. And so under General Gage is in charge. Howe, who's underneath him, sends these soldiers up this hill, which is never a good idea in military history. Like, don't attack uphill. So they head up this hill to destroy the American colonists on the 17th of June, 1775. And this is the first major battle between the two powers here. And so it takes the British 3 attempts. The Americans are at the top. They have this fortified position. The British are marching uphill. The British get beaten back in the first 2 attempts. And then finally on the 3rd attempt, the British make it to the top. The Americans are running out of ammunition, and the Americans have to flee. This is a famous painting of Dr. Joseph Warren, one of our founding fathers. He's a politician. He's a very famous doctor. And he's killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill here. And you can see the British coming up the hill. And so this is known as a Pyrrhic victory. A Pyrrhic victory is a victory where you win the battle, but you lose more people. So yes, the British win, but they lose more people. The British have about 1,000 casualties. We have about 400 casualties. Casualties is killed and wounded. And so even though we didn't win the battle, it definitely showed the British that hey, you can't just walk over us. We're going to put up a fight. And so the British had to be a little more cautious about attacking the Americans in the future. And so that's what happens at Breed's Hill / Bunkers Hill. This is 1775 again. We haven't even thought about the American, the Declaration of Independence or anything like that. In fact, we're still planning on something called reconciliation. So reconciliation is the key word in 1775. Yes, the shots have been fired, the war has started, but we can still make peace with the king. In fact, we sent an olive branch petition to the king trying to make peace with him. And so reconciliation, come back with the king. We're not thinking about independence just yet. So by the time they get to the Declaration of Independence, we've already fought our first major battles. Americans have already been killed by the British. We're still thinking about peace until about January of 1776. Then that mindset starts to shift towards independence. The king just doesn't even read the olive branch petition. He basically says we're all a bunch of rebels and we're all going to basically hang for it. And so from there, what happens is General Gage is now gone, and we have this new commander named General Howe who takes over. And so Washington starts to bombard the British in Boston Harbor. They bring in some cannons from upstate New York. Fort Ticonderoga is a British fort. Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, the famous Benedict Arnold, they capture Fort Ticonderoga, and they bring some cannons from Ticonderoga, some British cannons from Ticonderoga up here in New York. They bring them down here to Boston Harbor and actually use those cannons to bombard the British in the harbor. And so the British basically say, look, it's not working. We can't take Boston. Let's go somewhere else. And so General Howe, the new British commander, decides, let's try our luck here in New York. And what the plan is going to be is what's going to happen as they come down to New York. They assume New York because it has more loyalists, more Tories, people who support England. America is really divided on whether they support the colonist cause and independence or whether they support England and the king still. And so they think there's more loyalists here in New York. In fact, New York is the only state who doesn't vote on the Declaration of Independence. They abstain from voting, most likely because they know if they vote yes, like New York, who's coming for them, is going to destroy New York City. And so they choose not to vote yes or no on the Declaration of Independence. So anyway, General Howe has this new plan to come down here. Howe has his plan to take New York, and then there's another British commander from Canada named Burgoyne. So Burgoyne's going to come down Lake Champlain, Lake George to Lake Hudson, and they're going to come down the Hudson River. Howe's going to take New York and go up the Hudson River. The Hudson River is key because it separates like New England from the rest of the colonies. And so if they can cut off the head from the serpent, if they can cut off New England with the Hudson River, New England is where the revolution is happening. The revolution really hasn't spread to the colonies, and so hopefully by taking the Hudson River, they can cut off New England and the revolution won't spread. That's the idea anyway. And so what happens is Howe does take New York. We have the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, the Battle of Manhattan. And so, we know George Washington is our founding father, but George Washington isn't a great commander. He had some battles in the French Indian War, but part of the reason he was chosen is because he's from Virginia. And the colonists, when they created the Continental Army, Second Continental Congress, like before the Declaration of Independence, one of the first things the Second Continental Congress did was create a Continental Army, and they put George Washington in charge. And he's from Virginia, and that's a political move. Picking somebody from Virginia unites the colonies. If they would have picked a commander from like New England, it would be a New England battle, a New England war. Why would the other colonies care? Virginia was our biggest colony. And so by picking a Virginian, it helps bring those southern colonies into the fray, into the cause. So like I said, he's known for being this like American hero, but he actually has a losing record. He loses more battles here. And so he abandons Brooklyn Heights. They take Brooklyn. He has to abandon Manhattan. So they take Manhattan. And actually from 1776 until the end of the war, the British actually occupy New York. And so the plan is to cut them off at the Hudson River. But Howe, who takes New York, he gets a little greedy and he wants to go take Philadelphia now, which is the capital. Which is where the Continental Congress was meeting. And so instead of meeting Burgoyne here on the Hudson River and cutting New England off, he basically abandons Burgoyne and he heads over here to Philadelphia. And basically Burgoyne is left on his own and he's going to lose a battle because of that here. And so that's what happens here. In the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. So once again, Washington tries to stop them from taking New York at Brooklyn Heights. Washington fails. Washington has to retreat over the Delaware into a place called Valley Forge. Valley Forge is famous for being like the low point of America here. And so at Valley Forge in 1776 is the low point. So he's wintered there 1775 and 1776 and 1777. And that's kind of the low point here. So in 1776 and 77. So 1777 into 1778 is kind of the low point in the American army. The guys are starving to death. It's cold in the winter. They're even boiling their own shoes and eating their shoes. Like the American army was almost completely destroyed in the winter here. But luckily with help of Lafayette, a Frenchman, and von Steuben, a German commander, we had Polish commanders, French commanders, German commanders. They came over mainly like to boost their own status. They came over to help us in this Revolutionary War. So Lafayette Lafayette and von Steuben helped us kind of survive through this winter and then continue fighting on. Some of what I said, Washington has a losing record. Some of his famous battles that he does win, of course, most of you guys probably know this painting here, crossing the Delaware River. And so we're in kind of a bad state here in the winter of 1776. And Washington's, we're losing troops. Troops are bailing, they're abandoning, they're going back home, they're losing faith. And so Washington needs like a desperate victory. And so Christmas is typically a time you'd be celebrating and partying, which the British were. He decides to use Christmas Day as a surprise attack. And so typically wars we were back then, we don't fight at night and we don't fight in the winter typically. And so in the middle of winter on Christmas Day, Christmas night into the next morning of the 26th, they cross the frozen Delaware River and attack the unsuspecting British and the Hessians. The Hessians are basically German mercenaries. So the British are paying these German mercenaries to fight for the British. And they're caught asleep basically. They're partying over Christmas, they're drunk and hungover, and they aren't aware that the Americans are coming. And so he has a major victory there at Trenton. Trenton. And then also a couple days later, in the new year, he has a victory. We're going to watch that. He has a victory at Princeton as well. And so January 3rd, he wins at Princeton. So there's like two of his big victories. Here's a famous painting of George Washington commemorating his victory at Princeton. The story supposedly goes that while they're fighting at Princeton, of course, Princeton College, Princeton University, Alexander Hamilton possibly fired a cannon or ordered a cannon to be fired into a hall in Princeton and basically decapitated or almost decapitated this portrait of King George. And so they had to replace that portrait, and they hung up this portrait of George Washington instead. That's the story. I think it's King George II, actually, instead of King George III, because he founded Princeton. But that's not a big deal. But supposedly Alexander Hamilton fired the shot. So there's two of Washington's victories there. But we're definitely struggling in the winter of 76 and then also the winter of 77, which is kind of the low point at Valley Forge. So we have Howe going over to Philadelphia, abandoning Burgoyne. Burgoyne comes down Lake Champlain and the Hudson River. He has the officers, they're rich guys. They have all their stuff and luggage plus their wives. And so they're like sailing down the river, and eventually have to get out of their boats and walk along the river through these wilderness paths and through the swamps. They don't have enough horses. They don't have enough oxen. They can't pull all this luggage. The luggage and the women are slowing them down. The Americans start picking them off as they're going down like Lake Champlain. We start like burning bridges to make it more difficult for them. We slow them down to like a mile a day. Like that's all they're marching is a mile a day. So it's slow moving through some of the swamps here in the wilderness. And we're kind of like picking them off as they go. And by the time they get down here to Saratoga, they're extremely weakened by the time they get to Saratoga in October of 1777. This is considered the turning point of the war. And so Burgoyne is supposed to meet up with Howe. Howe abandons him, and he's all on his own. We have two commanders, American commanders. We have Horatio Gates, and we have Benedict Arnold. Washington's down by Philadelphia. And so Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold, they're there to stop him at Saratoga. Arnold isn't a traitor just yet. He will be shortly. And so basically they defeat Burgoyne here. They capture thousands of British soldiers, and this is considered the turning point of the war. And why is it considered a turning point? Because having this major victory shows the world and the French that, hey, we can actually win this thing. And so the French, along with the Spanish eventually, decide to join our side, and we make a Franco-American alliance. If it wasn't for the French help, we probably wouldn't have won the American Revolution. We definitely wouldn't have won it in the time frame that we did, but probably wouldn't have won it at all. Of course, the French want revenge for the French-Indian War. That's why they want to help in the first place. I mentioned Benedict Arnold. You guys all know him as the famous traitor. He took Fort Ticonderoga, and that was a huge victory for him. He wins the Battle of Saratoga. He tried to invade Canada in 1775. One of America's goals was to actually get Canada on our side as the 14th colony. That didn't work, obviously. We took Montreal, so we invaded Canada. We took Montreal. Benedict Arnold invaded and tried to attack Quebec. It was a failure. We laid siege to Quebec, and he had to basically abandon and run away from Quebec. And so we actually tried to invade Canada and get them on our side. Didn't work. So Benedict Arnold had actually won some battles. And so at Saratoga, it's the turning point of the war. He should be this big, huge hero, but he gets forgotten. Horatio Gates gets all the credit. He gets promoted over Arnold. Arnold's kind of pissed off that he's not getting the credit that he deserves. And so he decides to switch sides. And so what happens, especially now that the French are involved, he kind of says now that the French are involved, America's fighting for the French Catholics, and he doesn't want us to fight for the French Catholics. And so he decides to switch sides. He becomes commander of West Point, which is a fort that overlooks the Hudson River. And he comes up with this plan to hand it over to the British. He meets with a British commander named John Andres, and then their meeting is discovered. John Andres is actually captured and hanged for this. And then Benedict Arnold escapes, becomes the British commander. Fights in a couple battles for the British, eventually gets some land from the British, goes back to London and dies in London. But he becomes a traitor after Saratoga because he's not getting the credit he feels like he deserves. He's constantly overlooked, and everybody else is promoted over him, and he thinks he needs more respect, basically. So anyway, Saratoga is a huge turning point. That's when the French help us. That's the turning point of the Revolutionary War. So basically, they failed to cut off New England. So they did take New York. New York remains. They took New York and Philadelphia, and that remains in British hands. New York does until the end of the war. They failed to cut off New England, though. And so Howe, the commander, decides, okay, I'm done. I'm out. So Howe leaves, and we have this new commander named Clinton. And so Clinton decides, you know what, let's try our luck in the South. Once again, that whole idea of more loyalists in the South. So they come down here to the South, and they're trying their luck down there. Hopefully more loyalists will join them. And so the British have some major victories, Clinton and then eventually Cornwallis. They have some major victories here at Savannah, Georgia. So they take Savannah, Georgia. They take Charleston, South Carolina. And for a little while, they dominate South Carolina. They win this Battle of Camden. Horatio Gates, the hero from Saratoga, he comes down to the South and he actually gets his butt kicked at Camden. And so the British are kind of dominating here in South Carolina, and they do have a lot of loyalists that join their side. Thousands of loyalists join their side. And in the South, it kind of becomes a civil war between like the loyalists, the Tories, and the American colonists. In fact, this battle right here, Battle of Kings Mountain, it's actually a battle only between Americans. And so you have American loyalists who support the king, about 1,400 of them, versus about 1,000 American colonist patriots, and the patriots end up beating the loyalists. And so this is a battle where we have Americans versus Americans. So it does kind of turn into a civil war. Of course, the South is also a place with a lot of slaves, and so the British, starting with in Virginia, they basically say, hey, if you run away and join the British, we will give you your freedom. And so thousands of slaves, even some of George Washington's slaves, run away and join the British lines. So here in the South, it really does develop in a civil war. Loyalists and runaway slaves start joining the British to fight the American patriots. And so we do have a battle right here that's only like Americans versus Americans. And so that's what's happening here. Some slaves fight for the Americans, of course. Other slaves fight for, or freed blacks as well, fight for the British. So they're kind of torn on that part. So the South kind of turns into more of a civil war. You know, they've already had problems with like the regulator movement. You have the poor whites versus the rich whites in South Carolina and North Carolina. So they've already had problems with the regulator movement. They've already had like civil war style between the poor whites and the rich whites. And so the British are kind of using that to play the colonists off of each other's. And so the British are really kicking some butt at Savannah, Charleston, Camden. But then eventually tables turn. Cowpens is a huge victory for the Americans. You guys might have heard, you probably saw The Patriot. Although The Patriot's a movie and it's based on history, it's based on a guy named Francis Marion, and Francis Marion is known as the Swamp Fox. And so Morgan and Marion kick some butt at Cowpens. They kind of hide in the swamps. They use guerrilla warfare to pick off the British, and the British are they're struggling to gain ground here. Cornwallis, who's the commander that Clinton appointed here, Cornwallis doesn't want to be trapped in the interior of America during the winter. And so usually we don't fight during the winter. And so he decides to book it for the coast and winter on the coast and wait for British reinforcements. So Cornwallis, after this defeat at Cowpens, they head towards Yorktown, towards the coast to wait for British reinforcements, and then they kind of restart their campaign in 1782. And so Cornwallis comes here on this peninsula, and which kind of becomes the mistake of the war. The war probably should have continued on for several more years, but this definitely brings the war to an end quicker. And so Cornwallis is stuck on this little peninsula here in Virginia and Yorktown. And so he's hoping for British reinforcements to come in the Chesapeake, resupply them, and then in the spring of 82, they're going to resume their attack. However, this is where the Americans make their move. So the Americans have Greene here. Greene comes in, Nathaniel Greene, he comes up here with Lafayette coming down from the north, Washington and Rochambeau. So Washington, Rochambeau, who are up here in the north of New Jersey, they're going to come down with Lafayette, who's a British commander. You guys probably know him from the Hamilton musical. So Lafayette, I said British, he's a French commander. So the French with Lafayette come down, Washington, Rochambeau, they come down, and they basically block the British off by land. So they're stuck on this peninsula. They block them off by land. So basically Cornwallis can't go this way, and then before British supplies arrive, what happens is the French Navy, arrives first. So you have the French Navy trapping them on this side. You have the Americans and the French trapping them this side. Actually, at the Battle of Yorktown, the final battle, there was actually just as many French, if not more French, at the Battle of Yorktown than there were Americans. And so they're completely surrounded by the French on the water, the French and the Americans on land. Cornwallis has nowhere to go. He has no resupplies, and Cornwallis decides to surrender, bringing the war probably to an early end. And so Cornwallis surrenders, and the war is, for all intents and purposes, over. So that's Yorktown, October of 1781. The French Navy cuts them off. The French and the Americans, Lafayette and Washington, cut them off by land, and Cornwallis is stuck. October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrenders. Well, he doesn't, but his second command does because he's too scared. They surrender, and 7,000 British are captured. Now, this isn't like this is the end of the major battles, but it's not the end of the official end of the war, because we still have to work out a peace treaty. And so it takes until 1783 for the peace treaty. And so this is the end of the battles. Like, the British are getting tired of the war. You know, their taxes are raised to pay for the war. So a lot of British turn against this war. It's just like hurting their trade. Their taxes are going up. You know, they care more about the islands in the Caribbean. They're fighting the French and the Spanish in the Caribbean as well. And so they kind of get tired of this war. They're not really in support of it. And so after this last major battle, we don't really see any huge battles between the Americans and the British, but it takes a while to negotiate a peace treaty. And so eventually we do negotiate a peace treaty. It's called the Treaty of Paris, like many treaties in the world. And basically what happens is, first of all, the British recognize this as an independent country. So they do recognize this officially as an independent country. They give up all their territory claims from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. And so everything that you see here in green is now ours. So Atlantic Mississippi is now ours. This is the Ohio River Territory that we won in the French Indian War. They abandoned that. Of course, they still have Canada, which we were hoping would join us, but it doesn't. That's a key question to talk about, I think about. Why didn't the other British colonies join us? Why didn't Britain and all these Caribbean islands join us in the fight? Why were we the only 13 colonies out of the 20 plus colonies to break away? What made these 13 colonies different? Something to think about. So anyway, so we get from the Atlantic to here. The British were supposed to abandon some forts up here, but they don't, which is going to lead to the War of 1812. We get some fishing rights off the coast of Nova Scotia here. And then the Spanish, who helped us out, they get Florida back. Remember that the British took Florida in the French Indian War. Now the Spanish get it back. And so that's kind of what the United States of America looks like after the war. So 1783 Treaty of Paris, it's when we're officially recognized as an independent country by the British. And so the war is officially over. The peace treaty is signed, and America is a new country. So that's a quick recap of the war. I probably missed some things in there, but that's the basic overview of the war. There are 3 phases. Starts in New England, moves to the middle colonies in New York and Philadelphia, and eventually to the south, where Cornwallis is trapped at Yorktown, and the war comes to an end. The other last question I'll leave you with here to think about is, how was this ragtag group of colonists and militiamen able to defeat the strongest military in the world? And I'll leave you with that question there. Bye.